Is it no new thing for the ministers of the Reformed Presbyterian Church to hold forth and proclaim such sentiments as these? It has been their practice to do so ever since the Revolution. Is it true their testimonies and reproofs were not regarded, perhaps scarcely heard, by those who, being elevated in the sunshine of royal favor, looked upon them as a precise and impracticable set of men who, on the ground of mere punctilios and unintelligible crotchets, and shut themselves out from advantages which they might have shared with others? And we are fully aware that were these doctrines proclaimed by no other voice than ours, even at the present day, they would awaken little attention. Nay, although they were published with all the eloquence and skill in argument that have often been enlisted in the defense of opposite opinions, we are convinced, from the nature of the obstacles that resist their progress, they would make only a slender or transient impression. But when the Almighty arises to teach mankind, his word shall not fall to the ground. When momentous lessons, which may have been long disrelished or rejected, are embodied in the dispensations of divine providence, men's thoughts are forced into a new channel, and their cherished theories are confounded. How wonderfully has this been verified within the last few years in the experience of the Church of Scotland! The remarkable events which have occurred have proved the means of effecting changes of opinion, even in a period that may be reckoned by months, which a century of argument and remonstrance proved inadequate to accomplish. Who can contemplate the recent movement towards the abolition of patronage without astonishment, that has attentively observed the reception given to anti-patronage efforts and petitions, even within the last 10 years? Nay, the very veto law itself was an acknowledged effort to preserve patronage. It was artfully contrived for the express purpose of making such a plausible concession to the people as might prevent a formidable insurrection against this master grievance. The words of man may be despised, however true, even as the arguments and invectives that were wont to be hurled against patronage were scouted as the babblings of weak-minded people, or as the effusions of sectarian spleen and bitterness. But when God writes the lesson on the mighty events of his providence, it flashes conviction on the most reluctant observer. We do not yet despair, therefore, to behold the momentous doctrine so inadequately traced in the preceding lecture brought home with such power of conviction to the understandings and consciences of Christian men, that they shall as heartily denounce union between the Church of Christ and an ungodly civil government as they at present abominate the intolerable yoke of an unfettered lay patronage. And of this we feel the more assured when we observe that principles are avowed and confessions made, even already, by some of the most enthusiastic admirers and most able defenders of existing establishments, which, if followed out to their legitimate consequences, would lead them, at all hazards, to abandon every Erastian or anti-Christian alliance as a thing to be reprobated and abhorred. And here we crave liberty to present a few extracts from a recent publication, by one whose preeminent abilities and commanding eloquence have secured to him the first place among the living advocates of the Church of Scotland. Let us hear how Dr. Chalmers describes the difficulties the Church had to contend with in her efforts to promote reform. Quote, "The truth is that she has been engaged with a twofold, or rather a manifold perplexity. Her direct task, of itself sufficiently arduous, and in the prosecution of which she, in the divided state of politics, has to encounter difficulties of the most formidable description, is to obtain the consent of the legislature to some method of giving effect to her own views of ecclesiastical polity, free at the same time from the hazard of a conflict with the civil tribunals of the country." Unquote. Now the case, even as thus far delineated by the doctor, is distressing enough. That a Protestant church, under a Protestant government, in the light and liberty of the 19th century, should be unable to act on her own declared principles without incurring the hazard of a conflict with the civil tribunals of the country, is what could never have been anticipated by the admirers of the Revolution settlement. But there is an additional trial in the case, another fruit of the Church's alliance with an Erastian government, which the doctor proceeds to describe. Quote, "While thus engaged," he says, "she has over and above been exposed to a warfare of incessant annoyance from another quarter. The likeliest thing to it that I know in ecclesiastical history is the case of Nehemiah, whose proper task it was to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, but whose attention to the work was ever and anon called off by the perpetual assaults of Sanballat and the Horonites. Now, we, in the like manner, have a Sanballat and his Horonites to contend with, fierce and vigorous assailants, armed with peculiar weapons of hostility, and having the command of a very peculiar tactics. by which they cannot only bring down upon us a hand of violence from without, but stir up against us, and that in all the various quarters of our establishment, an anarchy and misrule from within our borders." Unquote. And here a footnote. The annoyance and danger from Sanballat and the Horonites do not yet appear to have reached their consummation, nor should it seem strange that it is so. The ecclesiastical fellowship with the Orthodox party in the Church have so long maintained that these Samaritans have been one of the great sins of the Church. The retributive justice of God would lead us to expect that when Christians from motives of expediency embrace ecclesiastical fellowship with the known enemies of the cross of Christ, they must suffer for their unfaithfulness, and that, in all probability, the parties with whom they have contracted the unlawful alliance will be made instruments for inflicting the punishment. Thus did the Lord punish the improper forbearance of the Israelites toward the Canaanites. Quote, "It shall come to pass that those whom ye let remain shall be pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and shall vex you in the land wherein ye dwell." Unquote. Having the settled conviction that ecclesiastical fellowship between the Orthodox party and the moderates is altogether unwarrantable and unfaithful, we have observed with extreme regret that at the last meeting of commission, the temporizing policy recommended by Mr. Candlish, who wishes to retain the moderates, seemed to prevail over the sound and correct views of Mr. Crichton, who wishes to be finally separated from them. If anything could add to this regret, it would be the fact that this unsound expediency doctrine should proceed from Mr. Candlish, who has been so honorably distinguished for high principle and orthodoxy. It is possible to convince the people that there can be anything is it possible to convince the people that there can be anything seriously wrong or dangerous in the system of moderatism, as long as the leading men of the most advanced section of the reformers in the Church regard the moderates as proper associates in church fellowship? The Scripture rule is, quote, "A man that is an heretic after the first and second admonition, reject." Unquote. But Mr. Candlish's counsel is, quote, "When you have got a few hundred heretics and sufficient power to expel them, take no step for their removal." Unquote. And the reason he is reported to have assigned for this advice is not less strange than the advice itself. He, quote, "detests their principles," unquote, but would deplore their secession as an event which might lead to the overthrow of the establishment. He admits that the Orthodox party might get on better without the moderates in the ecclesiastical courts, but believes that they could not get on without them, quote, "as an establishment," unquote. This statement exceedingly requires explanation. The aspect of it seems to be this, that in the present circumstances of the Church and of the country, an established Church cannot safely attempt to observe the law of the New Testament in regard to discipline.